so excited to have from Tilburn School of Humanities and Digital Sciences, Professor Neil Cohn. And Neil, let's talk about your journey, how you got into comics.
Well, first, thanks for chatting with me and having me here. How did I get into comic studies or comics, or which
Comic
part?
studies. Let's go with comic studies, and maybe
Sure.
the.
So,
Mhm.
yeah, they are linked. So I was reading comics and drawing comics since I was a little kid. I had my own comic company when I was like 10. I had a full mail order catalog that I sent out to family and friends and whatnot with my comics in it. And by the time I was like 14, I started working for Image Comics as just an assistant in the summers. And then the whole time, though, I was very into kind of the formal properties of comics without knowing that that's what they were. And by the time I read McCloud's Understanding Comics by when I was like 16, I was already pretty obsessing about these formalistic properties, and then that just opened the door even more for me to obsess over it. When I got to college, I actually didn't do anything. So my intent was always to draw comics as a professional comic artist. And when I got to college, I had a roommate who was taking classes in linguistics. And he cajoled me into taking linguistics classes with him, basically. And while I was taking a class on linguistics, I started recognizing that there were similarities between the way in which I understood that comics worked and the visual part, and the way in which I was learning about how language worked. So I just kind of kept probing that relationship, and that's what led to me, I guess, formally being part of comic studies or researching comics, as I just was writing down my ideas and then trying to share them with people. And part of sharing them led to me giving a talk right after basically right after I graduated from college at the Comic Arts Conference at Comic-Con International. And that was really my introduction to, there was actually a field of people who were studying comics at the time. And that kind of snowballed from there, and I just kept pursuing it. And that's kind of how I got into studying comics. It was kind of accidental. It was a weird thing for me to shift from wanting to draw comics to wanting to just studying them. And it was pretty much just because I found the studying part way more interesting and fascinating in a lot of ways.
Right, and you went on, got a master's degree, then a PhD, and started publishing a kind of, or bringing a more empirical approach to the understanding or to the study of comics. You've since published some very important works in this area, The Visual Language of Comics in 2013, and then The Visual Narrative Reader in 2016. You know, in a kind of almost elevator pitch, if it's possible, what is your approach, and how do comics make meaning?
Sure. So in many ways, I would advise to take a step back from the issue of comics when thinking about what my research is actually showing. So I do focus on comics quite a lot, but really I'm making a bigger argument, which is that our capacity to draw and our capacity to visually communicate is structured the same as language, and in fact is another type of language. So usually the very first day of class when I teach this, or some of my lectures, I usually ask students a question, which is, I say, do you speak? To which, here, I'll do it with you. Do you speak?
Yeah.
Maybe, kind of. Hopefully, yes. Okay. And then I say, what do you speak in? And mostly people say things like English or French or Dutch or Japanese or something like that. And then I usually say, do you draw? And then I get a lot more mixed responses from people. And then I ask, what do you draw in? And that's a weird question for people oftentimes, because there's no clear category for that question in English. So what do you draw in is really exactly parallel to what do you speak in, but we have a clear answer for what do you speak in, when we don't have for what you draw in. So my answer to what do you draw in is you draw in a visual language if you have learned a visual language. And a visual language is the system that you use when drawing. So what I do is try to highlight these similarities between the nature of the structure of drawing and the nature of structure of speaking. And we find very robust and sophisticated visual languages in comics. So the drawing part of comics are drawn in a visual language, in addition to the writing part of comics, which are using the written language, which is a graphic representation of the speaking part. So comics are using two languages at once. They use the visual language of the graphics, and they use the written language tied to speech. Much of, like I said, what I'm trying to highlight is then the nature of this structure of visual languages and how they're similar to spoken languages. That might have been longer than an elevator ride, but
No, that's
hopefully
good.
that makes sense.
So, kind of going to some of your earlier work, and within linguistics, are we? I mean, on a really kind of basic level here, talking about understanding that there is a universal grammar of visual language, and then there's a kind of idiosyncratic expression that is that kind of? Am I getting that
To
right?
some degree, yeah. I mean, I'm at least somewhat agnostic about the nature of what a universal grammar might be. I typically belong to a school of linguistic thought that is not quite emphasizing that there are very explicit principles of universal grammar. I think it's better to phrase that in a way of that we have some sort of cognitive toolbox that our brains have that allow us to speak, and that cognitive toolbox might not be specific to language itself. I believe that the grammar of sequential images is using similar cognitive mechanisms as the grammar of sequential words. And that those principles may very well connect to something even more general than words and pictures. It might connect to music and other sequencing methods that are not necessarily about language. It's about a more fundamental aspect of cognition more generally. But it is the case that I think that whatever this cognitive machinery we have that allows us to speak or to draw, etc., whether those are the identical systems in the brain or not, they do both allow for the general abilities and idiosyncratic manifestations, like you said. So that would be the difference between, say, language as an abstract idea and different languages of the world. So Japanese and English are different, and Swedish and Zulu or whatever, all different manifestations of what in principle have to be the same brain with the same cognitive toolbox. Yeah. And I think that visual languages are also not universal, which is why the visual language in Japanese comics looks different than the visual language in American superhero comics. They're drawn in different visual languages, so they have different properties to them. And part of the challenge is figuring out what those properties are and how those differences are, and where are they similar and how are they different, and trying to figure out what that system is built like.
Perfect segue to our next sort of series of questions. With your work, your really extraordinary kind of work and groundbreaking, cutting edge work and research, how would we read something fairly seemingly straightforward, like this peanut strip here, 4 panels, sort of telling a story? And I'm just going to kind of, if you agree, I'll move to this slide as you kind of
Sure.
unpack us.
Yeah, I kind of prepared for you a little bit here. So first of all, there's numerous levels of representation that we have to be able to decode and comprehend in order to understand even a simple sequence like this. I've left out here an analysis of things at the very basic level, like you have to know that there are lines and shapes here, and that these lines and shapes correspond to meaningful things. So the curves and straight lines that make up Charlie Brown, a tent, Snoopy, etc., that you have to be able to decode those curves and lines to understand that those are representations of things. That alone is a substantial cognitive task. You also might need to know things like the non-iconic information. So in this case, this doesn't have as many, but there's those little motion lines next to the hammer. You have to know that those mean motion. And not only is it that it's motion on its own, but that there's a relationship between the hammer and the lines that tell you that that is in motion and that they share a structural relationship. The lines are kind of attaching to the base of the hammer. So there's that relationship as well. There's also obviously compositional elements, all those things. The things that I've diagrammed here are about more the sequential meaning. And here again, you have numerous levels of structure. One of those levels is about layout, just how are these units arranged such that you can navigate across those units. In this case, we have a grid, which technically is ambiguous. You could read it like a Z path. You could read it up and down. You could make a U shape out of it, a C shape out of it. Those are all potentially viable paths. But we have rules that we've internalized that guide us through how we might order these. And those rules, at the very least, are something like this little tree structure I've shown. So this sort of tree shows you how things are embedding inside of each other. So we have essentially two horizontals, and the horizontals are just essentially rows. And those rows are associated within a vertical. That vertical is a column. So this essentially says that there are two rows inside of a column. And the highest level is also the canvas, and that's essentially the column level in this case, not always the case. And yeah, so this sort of layout is simply the surface representation of how we are arranging units, visual units together. But it doesn't tell us anything about the meaning or the content. Layout itself is not meaningful, but it can interact with meaningful content. So if you go to the next slide, this is kind of a representation of some of the complexity that is involved in understanding the meaning. And I've simplified it here. So there's kind of three structures that we can talk about. One is the narrative structure, which might be how is a message told. The event structure is the what is happening part, the what is going on here. And that's what the narrative ends up telling, is the meaning of the event structure. And what I've labeled in orange is what we could call a framing structure. And a framing structure is what is being shown to you relative to what is happening and what is understood. So in the event structure, what I've shown is there's kind of two tracks of meaning that are going on here, one for each character. There's the track of what's happening for Charlie. There's a track of what's happening for Snoopy. For Charlie, he's building a tent, he's getting a bag, he's carrying the bag, and then he's upset or pensive or whatever emotion that is in the last panel. For Snoopy, Snoopy's first just watching Charlie Brown. In the second panel, he's watching Charlie Brown. Then he's getting on the tent at some point, and then he's lying on the tent. Now, the getting on the tent part has to happen somewhere between panel 2 and 4. We don't know if it is at the moment of 3. We don't know if it's between the moment of 3 and 4. All of those things, it's ambiguous for us. All we know is that we have to eventually fill in that meaning that we're not seeing. In the narrative, it's just using what I would call a very simple narrative arc, which has an establisher, which sets it up, an initial, which kind of gets things going, a peak, which is the climax, and a release, which is the aftermath. In this case, the peak isn't really climactic. It's actually kind of the absence of a climax. There is a very clear sort of release, the kind of aftermath or resolution, but there's no clear climax. And this is actually using a fairly conventionalized narrative pattern that Schultz uses a lot. So where he will take away an actual climax and instead show you a relatively passive information. Typically what happens is at that absence of a climax, he's showing you the character that is not doing the main actions. Often a character who is watching the main actions happen, but you don't see those main actions. So that character is what I typically call an onlooker, where the onlooker can look at what's happening, but you don't see it. So that's exactly what's happening here. So the framing here Schultz is choosing as an author to show you Charlie carrying the bag instead of Snoopy getting on the tent. And then at the last panel, it shows you the aftermath that makes you think back and go, okay, this had to happen previously. So one of the things that this sort of approach highlights is the tension between what is shown and what isn't shown, and how different structures come together in that framing. So all of these things are happening in parallel to each other. It's not like one or another. They're all happening linked to each other. And unlike a lot of the emphasis, since especially McLeod in talking about comics, has been on what you don't see and talking about it as if it's in between panels. What I actually really like about this sequence, which I didn't provide, you sent it to me first, which was kind of nice, is that the unseen event that we're filling in, the Snoopy climbing on the tent, it's not that it's happening between 3 and 4 necessarily. It could be happening at the entire time as 3. It's not that the meaning is between something or is filled in because of it being between something. It's that Schultz is purposefully choosing to give you something less informative so that you then fill in the meaning. So it's about what he's actually choosing to show you compared to what he's choosing not to show you. It's not just about what's missing. It's about what is actually being chosen to be shown versus what's chosen not to be shown, that is generating what is the main inference.
Wow, yeah, I love that. Thank you.
So this is a relatively simple example. And I think if you still have it, I gave you a somewhat more complicated example as well.
Yeah.
So just to show you somewhat more complexity, this example is from a Japanese comic called Vagabond by Inoue Takehiko. It's actually my favorite comic. It's right there. Those are all of the volumes. And this is a fairly complicated sequence, even though it's just one page. So what's happening here is you have this older man and a boy. This is also layout-wise, I'll note, read from right to left. This man and a boy are walking up to this family. The man and the boy just rescued this girl. And so the girl is with her family, and then they bow to them in thanks. This page happens as an isolated page. It's not connected to other parts of the book in terms of the narrative, except at a higher level. It's a single page that has this one interaction. So what's actually happening here is, as you notice, the framing content, as I talked about with the other one, is very restricted oftentimes. And what that forces you to do is make even more complexity to link those things together. So the first panel just has the feet of the man and the boy, and then their faces. So all these first 4 panels are what I would call initial panels. They kind of set up the main event. And then that main event is paid off in the peak. That payoff is them bowing, basically. So in the first 2 panels, all you're getting is really the portions of those characters. So you mentally now have to add together feet plus head can combine to tell you that this is these characters. So you get that little N there is what that means. So the N means this is an entity conjunction. You're making an entity out of the parts of them. The relationship between the next 2 is the family as a whole, and then you're showing a zoom of that family. So you're simply refining the focus or zooming in. So there's a relationship of the zoom to the main view there. Now, both of those groups show independent characters. So the first 2 panels show you the man and the boy. The second 2 panels show you the family. But you still haven't yet constructed that there's a understanding that these 2 groups are in the same place. So that next level up with the E tells you they belong to a common environment. The E is for environment. So all of that is then building together. So you have parts of people that make people. You have a zoom that give you these people. Then you unite those to a common understanding. And then all of that links to the event. And now this is a fairly complex relations. And the way in which you kind of figure this out is by doing little tests. So if you go to the next, what I've done is show some manipulations for how you manipulate the sequence to show that there's these relationships. So in the first row, essentially what I do is a substitution test for the first two panels. So instead of showing now the feet and the body, you show them together. So essentially you're substituting views of the portions of the characters for the whole thing. And that's what those two panels are the equivalent of, is that bigger group. That's what's added up in your mind. In the next one, it's substitution for the first four, which is that high level where you construct the environment. That environment consists of, well, all of them together, which would be the equivalent of those first four. This is a little photoshopping that I had to do. And the last one is labeled wrong, omitting 2 and 4. 4 is actually omitting 1 and 4. So here, instead of a zoom and constructing individual characters, you're essentially just providing each of the two characters on their own. Those two things then still add up to the environment that's shown in the middle row. And so these sorts of substitutions and things are essentially how you arrive at the sort of analysis that I got to. You do these little diagnostics and manipulations and whatnot. And this is essentially what I do with my students when I teach this theory, is I say, okay, let's run our diagnostic. Let's do this test, let's do this test, and then we draw a tree together on the basis of what all those little tests tell us.
Again, you know, really significantly revising our understanding that somehow meaning is made in the kind of absent space between sequence. In fact, what you're talking about is a carefully composed, guided kind of sequence that adds up to, you know, levels and layers that add up to this kind of ultimate meaning making.
Yeah. So, and again, across all these structures, they're all interacting. So you have this framing structure is interacting with the kind of narrative structure, which is what I call the grammar of the sequence of images, for what you are or not seeing and how, and then those link together. Those are linking together with the meaning that's being expressed at the same time. And all of those are linking together with the layout. So, you know, the layout here could be rearranged in all sorts of different ways. That doesn't affect the narrative structure as long as the meaning is in the same order. However, through the layout, you can give emphasis or something to in different ways. So here, that zoom panel is given a lot more focus, which is almost like an intonation pattern in speech. We really emphasize a particular word by saying, you know, it's this one, right? There, I'm really giving emphasis. It is adding a little bit of focus to the meaning, but it's not fundamentally changing the syntax necessarily for the grammar. And that's what's happening by the layout. The layout here is really enabling you to, you know, bring focus to certain aspects of the expression through the layout at the same time. But the layout itself isn't the meaningful thing. The layout is having an effect on the meaningful structures. So it's a complex kind of interconnection of these different structures that are then, you know, feeding into each other to make this bigger meaning making.
And it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but really the generative sort of property here is really the shaping devices and the layout all combined, right? Not the story necessarily. It's the way the story is given shape, right?
Right. So, and that's, well, I've highlighted that particular structure here as the narrative structure. That's how it's given shape. To simplify things, I've kind of simplified the other parts, but all of them have these sort of compositional elements. All of the structures have these sort of building block sort of nature of hierarchies, and they all are doing fairly complex things in their structures themselves. So layout does have quite a lot of complexity on its own. It's just then when they all interface together is when this kind of alchemy occurs that is making something even more complicated. So, you know, you can isolate each of them, but they also are, inevitably they're all interacting on these different, you know, levels in ways that are interacting. So you could potentially take this same sequence, maybe rearranging the layout is going to have you emphasize certain portions or another, it's not changing the grammar, it's not changing the meaning of it all, but it might be changing, the emphasis of certain portions of that sequence.
Right.
Or if you actually did manipulate then the actual order of the panels, now you're going to be changing the way in which that grammar is expressing that meaning. The meaning is mostly staying consistent, but how you're presenting it might alter the interpretation to some degree as well. So there's a lot going on. It's a very complicated system.
No, I love it, and you're breaking it down beautifully. So what is my brain like? How am I making meaning out of something as extraordinary as this? Kirby mode.
Yeah, I mean, so this is one image also, I'll point out. So one image is going to operate slightly different than a sequence of images. But what's interesting to point out here is that there's kind of a difference immediately just in that this is a unit from a comic that does have a sequence, right? There's a lot more going on in this one panel than in any of the panels from that Japanese comic. So those units are a lot simpler. Here we have a much more complicated sequence, single image. And there might be good reasons for that we can talk about. So if you're talking about what is it that your brain actually doing, so what we already talked about was what I would call, or what cognitive science would call representations. So the representations are the type of knowledge you bring to bear in comprehending something. But then the brain is doing processing that is kind of processing on those representations, assumably. But the processing might not be the representations entirely. So processing involves things like working memory and long-term memory and all those sorts of things, which are likely, interacting with those representations, or those representations are somehow embedded into those cognitive structures, but they're not the same. So if you're asking what the brain is doing, I think that what the brain is likely doing is these more processes rather than the representations. So the way I and other scholars, cognitive scientists have been started talking about this is there's, again, numerous kind of levels that stages you go through. And because there's these different structures that are interacting, you might be processing across these different structures in sort of parallel ways that are interacting as well. So, at first, glance, you're immediately going to do things like your eyes are going to move around and fixate on different parts of the image and extract information from those portions of the image that tell you that these are meaningful things. And there's going to make correspondences between, the visual perception and the mental representations that you have that tell you about meaningful things. So like, okay, I see this thing that has a face, that's a person, right? Things like that. As you're reading this, you're going to be pulling that information into your semantic memory, we call it, to recognize all these things. There's people, there's, let's say it's a building that person is in. There's rocks, right? These people are doing actions. They're flying, they are talking, things like that. And then that information is going to be incorporated into what's called a mental model or a situation model. And a mental model is essentially the constructed understanding of a given representation or a given sentence or a movie or a comic. It's all roughly the same process where you're incorporating these things into this understanding. And as you get to each sort of new panel or new piece of information, whether it's within a single image, cross images, you're revising this mental model for either a more fleshed out version of it, or because you have to alter your expectations of it. So as you realize what one person is saying, then contrasts with the next person saying, you're going to keep revising this mental understanding of it. And as you read across any sort of discourse, whether it's text or comics or whatever, you're building this understanding. Eventually, much of that mental model will be pushed over. So that mental model is being built with working memory. So that's the memory that you have what you're holding in your mind at this moment. And then some of that information is going to be pushed over into long-term memory as you remember what happened in that comic, right? Oh, I read that comic. It had, these characters and they did these things. And, I remember this. Sometimes for your whole life, you'll remember it. Other times it will fade away. You'll rarely remember a lot of the details because what is being stored in long-term memory is, a portion of what was built in working memory to begin with. And so then you retain some understanding of it in the future, but others fade. The very first thing that fades is the surface stuff, like, okay, what is the, what were the lines like, which direction were people going, what was the exact sequencing, things like that. That stuff fades from memory, but you retain the gist and the general knowledge of like what happened and what did the characters do, things like that. So that's kind of the general kind of progression of how comprehension goes. And then further on into how you can comprehend into the future as you retain or don't retain information. And so it's a matter of building this sort of mental model on the basis of the information you're given. And all of these sort of rules and principles that you are engaging are somewhat probabilistic. So by which I mean you are revising things on the basis of what knowledge you know. So like this example, I don't know enough about this Kirby comic to give clean examples, but say in Peanuts, you might make predictions of what might happen next on the basis of your knowledge. In Peanuts, if Charlie Brown's running up to a football, conventionally, because you've read enough Peanuts, you know that Lucy might pull the ball away, right? So that's some sort of probabilistic knowledge that you have. But that might not carry over to a non-Peanuts football game, right? If it's Calvin and Hobbes, you don't necessarily think that Hobbes is going to pull the football, right? Because that's not the conventions of that particular strip. You also might know, various other stored knowledge about how people are supposed to look, how they behave. In various comics, who's good guy, who's bad guy. I have expectations for how they behave, and if they don't, then I have to revise my understanding of that character. All that information is the semantic representations that you use to make sense of that mental model. So there's kind of this progression of the way knowledge flows throughout.
And sometimes those revisions, those moments can be like extremely pleasurable moments, right?
Oh, absolutely. And so just to give the case of the one where we had to make an inference by looking at Snoopy on the tent and looking back at Charlie Brown, right? In this case, that the looking back, mentally looking back, not necessarily physically looking back, but the mentally, you might physically look back as well, but the mental look back to understand that Snoopy got on the tent and understand that inference happened previously, that event happened previously, that is a revision of the mental model. You have to now, you see a visual surface that conflicts with the given information that you've already seen. And so now you have to revise your mental understanding in this mental model to figure out, well, why is it not just completely incongruous? Like he floated up there or, magically appeared. Oh, no, he climbed up there, right? And these are things that you do instantaneously without thinking about it. But that's a mental operation that you find pleasurable. And that's where the humor comes from in that strip, is the revision process in that strip is likely where the humor and the enjoyment are generating from.
And so
absolutely.
This, Neil, I'm sure you've had this question posed to you a gazillion times, and we sort of started to get at this at the beginning of our conversation, but how can we, or how do you talk about this as a cross-cultural kind of project?
Mm-hmm. Well, I conceive of it in the same way, and this is the data that I gave you to share, which is, I conceive the same way as in language, which is there's likely underlying building blocks that are similar across languages. Doesn't mean that all languages have all of those same properties, but there's likely, you're using the same brain to generate these sorts of information. And there's different ways that different cultures are going to manifest those principles. So it's different, you might have sequencing in all of them, and they may or may not have similar sequencing methods. And then it's a challenge of figuring out what is similar and what is different across cultures. We already saw one example of that, which is really nice, between the difference between the Kirby panel one was very simple. And this is actually something we've studied quite a lot of. So this what you're seeing is a graph of coding that we made of 290 comics. We coded about 150 panels per comic. This is roughly 36,000 panels represented here. Most of them, each of these kind of groups of Swedish, French comics, Dutch, etc., there's at least 10 comics per group represented here. And what this is an analysis of different types of framing devices for how much information is in a panel. And our categories are what are on the left there. So a macro panel has multiple interacting, what I call entities, which would be multiple interacting characters, essentially, in a frame. A mono just has a single character representative. It doesn't matter if it's a full view, like in film shot terms, or a close view, it's a single character. A micro has a subsection of a character that is less than a face, or less than any other body part that's not face, a hand, feet, whatever. And I call that a micro because it's smaller than a single character. And an amorphic panel has information that is non-character information. It's something that's aspects of the environment. What McLeod would have included in his aspect-to-aspect transition, but that's really describing the contents of the panel, not a relationship between panels. So that's an amorphic panel. And I'll point out that this analysis is something that's coming, that will be part of my next book, which is coming out later this year, which is going to be called Who Understands Comics, which is all about the cognitive operations that we go through to understand sequences of images, but also more asking the question of who does or does not understand a sequence of images. And so I look at cross-cultural data from people who don't seem to be able to understand the sequence of images, and why. Kids, when do kids start being able to understand a sequence of images? Various neurodiverse populations like autistic individuals and schizophrenics and people like that. So there's quite a lot of, it's a very psychology sort of view on who does or does not understand comics and why, basically. In any case, this analysis here, what we did is looked at these different types of framing types across various types of comics. What you can see is in the blue zone here, all of these European books look very similar to each other. They all use about twice as many macros, that's full representations of scenes, as monos, so single panels, characters. They use hardly any micros or amorphic panels, very small amounts. The classic American comics, which are essentially American comics from the 1940s through the 80s, or up till 1980, sorry, 40s through the 70s, they look just like the European comics. The classic American comics, that ratio between monos and macros has gotten a little bit smaller. So that is now, these are from the 80s to 2014. Now there's more monos, but still more macros than monos. And indie comics, which are essentially graphic novels, things like books by Drawn and Quarterly, For Seconds, those sorts of books. Those look exactly the same as superhero comics from modern times. What ends up looking different is the Asian comics. Now in the Asian comics, the Japanese, both female, which would be shoujo and josei comics, the male comics would be shonen and seinen manga, and then Korean manhwa and Hong Kong manhwa. All of those are using more monos than macros, and many more micros and amorphic panels. What's really interesting is that what you see in the middle, in between there, is what are called OEL manga, which are original English language manga. So these are essentially quote unquote manga that are drawn in to look like Japanese comics, but produced by English speakers. And those are actually looking like they're in between what the Japanese ones are and the American ones are. So they're not fully like the native Japanese comics, but they're not, completely like the American comics, even though they are drawn to look like Japanese comics. So what you end up with is these different strategies of how framing of information happens. So the American and Western books tend to pack more information per unit, per panel, and the Asian ones seem to have less information per panel, more individual characters. And there's lots of reasons why this could be. But at the very least, what it means is if we go back to the discussion of the sequencing devices, what it implies also is that the sequencing devices are going to be more complicated in the Asian comics because they're going to need more machinery to link together this smaller information per unit. The sequencing in the Western books is going to be more simple, but the units are more complex. And this is the same sort of trade-off that we see in languages, is that the more complex the word units are, typically the less complex the syntax is. And the more simple the word units are, the more complex the syntax is in different languages. So you get the same sort of trade-off between grammar and morphology, we'd say, in linguistics. And so this both shows you what is similar across cultures as well as what is different, and shows you a distribution across this space. Wow. So these sorts of analyses I find very important and fascinating.
I can't wait for your book to come out. Is that another Bloomsbury publication? Or?
Yeah, it's under Bloomsbury as well. So that'll be at the end of the year, maybe even 2021, given the way the world is going these days. But right now, I believe it's at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021.
Fantastic. I can't wait. So, gosh, you've already provided so many insights and tools for us, but what is a Neil Cohn trademark classroom technique?
Classroom techniques. So, I mean, my classes are typically very linguistic-y classes. And much of the way I teach, when I teach this sort of material, is to try and get students to recognize the intuitions that they have for different structures and to probe those. So if you violate a structure, you can see how a structure works by violating it, essentially. So if you make it do something that you go, oh, that's weird, then that reveals something about how it works. And what's interesting is that a lot of times the things that comic scholars find most interesting are the places where authors are already doing this, where they are essentially playing with the visual language to do something that is a little bit abnormal. And to some degree, I'm more interested in things that are normative, the regularities that those deviations are playing off of. So both of them are worth studying and worth describing. It's just you have a different focus. So the way that I would say, talk about teaching comics, I would highlight the way that these different structures are interacting. So there are different structures and they're interacting, and how might that work? Rather than just thinking that it's all one structure, for example. How can you manipulate those structures to get different results? So what happens if you change the order of the panels? What happens if you maintain the same order but a different layout? How can you manipulate the structures to reveal how they're working? How do you play with this idea of what is shown versus not shown? So how would you, go about, describing both what is shown to you and what is not shown, and then talking about that tension that's there. And then also talking about what knowledge does a person have and the fluency for it that allows you to understand these things. So, the fact that manga are structured in a different way than Western comics means that the people who read those books have different sets of knowledge that they're bringing to bear on understanding a sequence. So we can't necessarily presume that the comprehension mechanisms are exactly the same and are going to be the same for both people. So if you only read superhero comics and you pick up a manga, it might feel weird. Why might that be? Is because you don't have the same structures that they have. And then vice versa. If you only read manga and then you said they read a superhero comic, what are those structures that are influencing the way you understand? So what is the fluency that you have in order to understand these things? So I think it's important for people to reflect on that. And I know there's kind of one thread of people who think that all of this understanding is universal and it comes for free. I can tell you already that that's not the case. And I think many comic scholars have the experience where they have somebody in their class or whatnot who doesn't understand stuff as smoothly and has challenges with it, and then it's suddenly very weird for them because it goes against the assumptions they have of this being universally understandable. And I think it's important to focus on that sort of fluency issues, and that is exactly what this book that I just wrote is all about: is these fluency issues, and when the comprehension of various people might go against what you would the kind of assumptions we have of transparency.
Amazing. You've already shared with us a lot of the kind of data that you've been generating that's more than just taxonomic.
Yeah.
What about this visual language lab? And what is Tintin?
Yeah, what is Tintin? Other than the Hergé bande dessinée. So in my lab here at Tilburg, we do a lot of different types of research. We do brain research on visual communication in comics and visual languages. We also do behavioral research, so reaction times, things like that. And we also do this sort of coding of information. And I was recently, so what Tintin is the acronym for a fairly large grant project that I just started this year, funded by the European Research Council. And what we're doing is we are designing a software program that allows people to analyze the properties of visual communication and multimodal communication, so text-image relationships. There's been other people who have designed these sorts of programs, but this one is kind of a bulked up version that does a lot more what I want. And it's going to hopefully be flexible enough that other people can adapt it to any sort of research that they're doing, but it'll come pre-specified with all of my sort of distinctions in it. But what we're doing with this, and this is going to be freely available and open in a couple of years, hopefully, once we're doing it. My programmer is currently programming the software as we speak. And it's not quite yet ready for distribution, but it's getting there. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to be coding 1,500 comics from around the world for many, many, many different types of structures. Right now, my list of things that we're going to be looking for is about 450 different sort of fields of annotation. And we're going to be coding the properties of them from around the world, not just, so already in that list, I had kind of European, American, and Asian comics, but we're also going to be adding things from Africa, India, Southeast Asia, South America, everywhere around the world. If people have stuff that they want me to look at in it, they're welcome to reach out and give me stuff. But we're going to be analyzing comics around the world, and we're going to be looking at that sort of analysis that we did before, but in a kind of bulked up way. So we're going to be looking at how do visual languages of the world that are used in comics differ from each other? How are they similar to each other? And do they reveal some sort of cross-cultural trends for how information might be conveyed? And then in connection to that, how does comprehension interact with that? So, if there's a structure that's used more in Japanese comics, will readers of Japanese comics comprehend that in a different way than people who don't read Japanese comics? And then on top of that, how are the spoken languages from the people who create those comics interacting with those structures? So that is to say, are there properties of visual languages that are influenced by the properties of spoken languages? For example, are there properties of superhero comics that are reflections of the way the English language structures information? Are there structures of the way that manga are built that reflect the way that they're structured from spoken Japanese? I don't have a strong intuition for whether there will or will not be these sorts of influences, but that's what we're at least looking for to see, across certain dimensions of linguistic structure that have been talked about in language, to see if there's these relationships. So this is what we're doing over the next 5 years, basically.
Amazing, really amazing, and that you've got such incredible support for it is equally amazing.
I'm always amazed at that. Yeah.
So you've kind of, in a way, you've identified this space that you've worked so hard to clear
Mhm.
you know, in the study of comics as a vital space. But if I were to ask you the question about, well, comics themselves that are like on your bedstand, and comic studies today that you're sort of excited about, outside of your own field, what would those be?
Well, in the case of actual comics, like there are certain books that I really love. You know, Takehiko, I already mentioned. I love all of his stuff. His book Vagabond is wonderful. Also great from him is Real, which is about wheelchair basketball players. That's also a very different topic, but masterfully done. There's a lot of other books that are fantastic. I recently read Cover by David Mack, which is kind of a nice sort of meta reflection on the nature of comics and comic creators interacting with kind of a neat kind of spy story. I've known David Mack since I was a teenager, and he gave it to me at the last Comic-Con I was at, or I bought it from him, I should say. And it's great, and he's a modern master, and he's fantastic. And I think that there would be a lot of good done if people analyzed his sort of work, because it's really innovative and masterful. Those are just some of the books that I would want to mention. I'd also mention, say, Xander Cannon's work with Kaiju Max, etc. He's been doing fantastic books for ages. In comic studies, I mean, there's all sorts of really great work on comic studies. One of the nice things about studying comics is that people do it across so many different types of disciplinary boundaries. And I think people need to both recognize where they're coming from those different perspectives, but at the same time appreciate the diversity that there is in there. So like, you know, there are people doing empirical work, like analyzing, for example, just Chris Claremont's X-Men run. There's a Twitter feed that just analyzes that and has all sorts of insights. And it's not necessarily on the cognitive type that I look at, but they do a quantitative analysis. And they have all sorts of interesting things to say about it. And I think that sort of thing is really interesting. I can also mention that there's work on the more inching towards the cognitive front. You know, I have colleagues who are doing computational analysis on comics as well. It's kind of fascinating about, you know, how can computers understand what's going on in comic panels? That's a very non-trivial question. Or even more challenging is trying to get computers to generate comics that are comprehensible. That's also really interesting. Those are all things that I find fascinating because they're connected to what I'm doing, but not explicitly the same. And then on the humanities side, there's always been fascinating work in comic studies. So analyzing the sociocultural impact and, you know, all of those sorts of questions are fascinating to me. So I think it's just a matter of finding what, you know, what inspires you in particular in this very diverse field to find what is most interesting to you.
It's fun. It's interesting that Paul Gravett, in a conversation video cast that I did with him a few weeks back, alerted me to an area that I didn't have much, I actually didn't know about, which is comics in Braille.
Oh yeah. So
yeah.
I actually know some people who've been doing this. There's a Dutch company here, in fact, that has makes resources for blind individuals, and one of the things they did was made I think it was a Tintin comic, Asterix, that's all in relief. And there's another approach to this by Casey Zakroff, who is a marine biologist who also made a comic for the blind about marine biology. And there's some very fascinating things that are going on there. I actually have colleagues here at Tilburg who are interested in this topic and have been talked about exploring it a bit. So it's a really fascinating sort of question of how do you convey a visual sort of phenomena to somebody who can't see. And it's a fascinating topic indeed.
Absolutely amazing. Gosh, Neil Cohn, thank you so much for unzipping your brain and teaching us so much about your work, but comics in general. Thank you for telecasting, video casting in from Tilburg University School of Humanities and Digital Sciences, and also the Department of Communications and Cognition. Thank you, Neil.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This has been a pleasure, and I'm glad to be able to do it. So thanks for having me.